Keefe D is getting snitched on at his Tupac murder trial, and rappers are going off. 50 Cent is trolling everyone involved. Suge Knight is calling out witnesses from prison, and Snoop Dogg keeps getting dragged into the mess. But some of the biggest reactions are coming from people who see Keefe D's situation as a warning. Let's get into it. The Dwayne Keefe D. Davis murder trial began in a Nevada courtroom on August 17th, and within days, it had already produced the kind of courtroom moment that makes an entire genre of music go quiet and pay attention. The murder trial for alleged Tupac Shakur killer, Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, began, with opening arguments happening almost exactly 30 years after Tupac was gunned down near the Las Vegas Strip. Prosecutors say Keefe planned the murder and produced the gun used to kill Tupac, though they say he's not the man who fired the fatal shot. That's the charge: first-degree murder with a deadly weapon and a gang enhancement attached on top of it. By day 2, a former Las Vegas cop was already on the stand, describing the night Tupac was shot. And by day 3, the whole thing had turned into a spectacle nobody in the courtroom could control. Through 2 days of testimony, prosecutors had called over a dozen witnesses to describe the fatal shooting in 1996 and gang tensions that preceded it. One of the witnesses called that week was a man named James McDonald, known on the streets as Mob James, a former Mob Piru Bloods member who used to run security for Suge Knight and Death Row Records. And the second he walked into that courtroom, things got personal. Keefe D reportedly wasn't sure what Mob James was going to say once he got on the stand. And according to reporting from that day, Keefe D wasn't so sure what McDonald was going to do on the stand. So much so that it appears he called the man a feckin' rat under his breath as he entered the courtroom. Think about the irony of that for a second. A man who spent 15 years bragging on camera about murder, calling somebody else a rat in a courtroom on the record, while that same man is refusing to help convict him. Because here's the twist: Mob James didn't actually snitch on Keefe D, not in the way Keefe D seemed to fear. Mob James made it clear he wasn't interested in helping send an old rival to prison while taking the stand. And he repeatedly resisted questions about the decades-old gang conflict surrounding Shakur's death. When prosecutors and even the defense pushed him to identify who was in the car, who pulled the trigger, what he actually saw, he shut it down. He told the court, "I'm aware of a lot of things that was going on. People ain't talked about it in 30 years. Today ain't one of them." And when Keefe D's own defense attorney pressed him further, hoping he'd help clear his client, McDonald turned that down too, telling the courtroom flatly that he didn't want to send him to prison, even though they don't like each other. That clip hit social media within hours. A clip of the exchange was shared on X and gained hundreds of thousands of views within hours, sparking much discussion. Hip-hop commentators, YouTubers, and fans who'd been following this case for years all had the same reaction. A man who's been called a rat to his face by the defendant just refused to be one. The only reason he showed up at all, McDonald made clear, was because he could be held in contempt if he refused to testify. So if Mob James didn't do the snitching, who did? That's where this story gets interesting, because the real damage against Keefe D isn't coming from reluctant gang members on the stand. It's coming from cops, from federal agents, and from Keefe D's own mouth, recorded years before he ever thought he'd be charged. Prosecutors have called numerous witnesses over the days of testimony, including one former Las Vegas cop who claims Tupac knew who shot him, but wouldn't rat the killer out to cops. That's a detail that's been floating around this case for 30 years, finally being said under oath. Tupac himself refused to snitch on the man who killed him, even while dying. It's a strange kind of poetry that the man now on trial for planning that murder is the one being taken down by testimony, tape recordings, and paperwork instead of street loyalty. And then there's Reggie Wright Jr., the former Death Row Records general manager and head of security, who also took the stand that same week. According to reporting on the day's proceedings before Mob James, former Death Row Records general manager and security director Reggie Wright spoke to the court, adding his own account of the gang tensions and the security situation around Suge Knight's camp back in 1996. Wright's testimony didn't have the theatrics of Mob James calling out the defense, but it filled in pieces of the timeline that prosecutors have been building for years: the MGM Grand altercation, the drive to Suge Knight's club, and the movements of everyone connected to Death Row that night. Meanwhile, rappers who've spent years commenting on this case from the outside started weighing in the second the courtroom drama went public. 50 Cent, who has never missed an opportunity to comment on anything involving Diddy or the Death Row era, posted a courtroom clip to his page and mocked the entire proceeding, writing that everybody involved needed to just tell everything a jab aimed squarely at the layers of secrecy that had protected everyone in this case for 3 decades. Suge Knight, watching from prison in San Diego, weighed in almost daily. He told TMZ directly that Keefe wasn't the only one involved in Pac's assassination, and some of the witnesses are full of crap. That's Suge Knight, the man who was in the car when Tupac was shot, the man who survived it, openly calling the credibility of the state's own witnesses into question from behind bars, while the trial that could finally close this case plays out without him able to do anything but watch. And Snoop Dogg, who's been dragged into this saga for over a year now thanks to Suge Knight's own accusations, has largely stayed above the courtroom noise this time. But his name keeps surfacing anyway, because everyone connected to death row in that era is getting pulled back into the conversation, whether they want to be there or not. So that's where things stood heading into the trial's second week. A defendant calling a witness a rat in open court. That same witness refusing to cooperate anyway, and a chorus of rappers picking apart every single day of testimony in real time. But to understand why this trial carries this much weight, you have to go back to how Keefe D ended up here in the first place. Because long before any of these witnesses opened their mouths, Keefe D had already opened his. Before we get any further into who's testifying against Keefe D, it's worth understanding something that makes this entire case unlike almost any murder trial in American history. The prosecution's star witness is arguably Keefe D himself, from years before he was ever arrested. Dwayne Keefe D. Davis is the self-described shot caller who spent years narrating his role in the drive-by that killed Tupac Shakur. For nearly 2 decades, Davis talked. He talked to police in a 2008 proffer interview. He talked to documentary filmmakers. He talked on Vlad TV. And in 2019, he put it all into a book called Compton Street Legend, where Las Vegas prosecutors say he incriminated himself, along with the many interviews he's given to police and media outlets since 2008. He wasn't arrested for any of that until 2023. Keefe D regularly bragged about his alleged involvement with the murder in the years after the slaying, and he was finally arrested by authorities in 2023. The arrest happened near his home in Henderson, Nevada, and he's been in custody ever since, currently held at High Desert State Prison as the trial plays out. The reason it took so long comes down to a single legal argument his defense has leaned on for years, that Davis believed the statements he made to police back in 2008 were covered under an immunity deal, meaning nothing he said could ever be used against him in court. That argument finally collapsed right before this trial started. Keefe D's Nevada Supreme Court immunity appeal, the big open question in this case, failed, clearing his memoir and 2008 interview for trial. In other words, every word he ever said about that night, every bragging interview, every page of his own book, was suddenly fair game for prosecutors to read straight to a jury. That's a brutal position for any defendant to be in. Most murder cases live and die on circumstantial evidence, shaky eyewitnesses, forensic timelines. This one has the defendant's own voice, on tape, describing details of the crime that only someone involved would know. Davis has repeatedly described his role, revealing he allegedly supplied the gun to his nephew, Orlando "Baby Lane" Anderson, in his memoir. The backstory itself has been told so many times it's practically hip-hop folklore at this point. But it matters here because it explains exactly why so many names from that era are being pulled into a Las Vegas courtroom 3 decades later. On September 7, 1996, hours before the shooting, a brawl broke out at the MGM Grand between Tupac's entourage and Crips-affiliated Orlando "Baby Lane" Anderson, Keefe D's nephew, reportedly stemming from an earlier robbery of one of Tupac's associates. Hotel security cameras caught the fight. Tupac and his crew, along with Suge Knight, jumped Anderson in the lobby, and it was all recorded on camera for the whole world to eventually see. Prosecutors say Davis and his associates spent the rest of the night hunting for payback. Hours later, Tupac was riding as a passenger in a BMW driven by Suge Knight, heading toward Knight's Las Vegas club after watching a Mike Tyson fight, when a car pulled up beside them at a red light and opened fire. By Keefe D's own account, his car later pulled up beside the BMW, carrying Tupac and Suge Knight, and Anderson opened fire. Tupac was hit multiple times and died 6 days later at 25 years old. Suge Knight survived, wounded by bullet fragments. Anderson, the man Davis has long claimed pulled the trigger, was never charged. He was killed in an unrelated shooting in 1998. For 27 years, that was where the case sat. A well-known story, repeated in documentaries and podcasts, But with the one man still alive and talking about it, never facing a single charge, because prosecutors could never build a case that would hold up beyond his own bragging. That changed when a Clark County grand jury indicted him on a single count of murder with use of a deadly weapon, carrying a gang enhancement, and he's pleaded not guilty and been held without bail ever since. Now, walking into this trial, Davis's own team has tried to reframe everything he said for all those years as nothing more than talk for cameras and book sales. Sources close to him say his past admissions in an interview that he was involved in the slaying are simply empty brags. His attorney, Michael Sanft, has directly challenged the credibility of everything his client has ever said publicly, pushing prosecutors during the trial to answer what facts they actually have to support any of what Keefe D said in any of his interviews or his book. It's a wild defense strategy on paper, arguing that literally everything your client has said for 17 years in writing, on camera, under his own name should be dismissed as fiction. But it's the only card left to play once the immunity argument fell apart, because Davis himself has said things over the years that go far beyond just admitting he was in the car. One of those things involves an accusation that's pulled an entirely different music mogul into the middle of a murder trial, and it's become the single biggest storyline running alongside the actual courtroom testimony. Because according to Keefe D's own recorded statements, this wasn't just a street beef that spiraled out of control. According to him, somebody paid for it. That accusation, and the reaction is pulled out of the hip-hop world, is where this story goes next. If there's one piece of testimony that turned this trial from a regional true crime story into a national headline, it's the moment jurors heard Keefe D's own voice claiming Sean Diddy Combs put a price on Tupac's head. During day 3 of the trial, the court heard audio of Keefe D telling law enforcement that Diddy had put money on the heads of Tupac and Suge Knight. An FBI investigation ensued, but nothing came of it. This wasn't a new rumor invented for the trial. It's a story that circulated in hip-hop circles for years, dating back to interviews Davis gave long before his arrest. But hearing it read into evidence in a first-degree murder trial gave it a weight it never had before. On Thursday, jurors heard Keefe D's secret 2008 interview called a proffer, where he claimed Diddy proposed a $1 million bounty for Tupac and Suge Knight. The recording captured Davis describing the alleged conversation in vivid detail, quoting Diddy as supposedly saying he wanted to get rid of them, with Davis claiming he replied that they'd wipe them out for a fee, adding that they wanted $1 million. This wasn't the first time this claim had surfaced either. Back in 2024, court filings connected to Davis's bail request had already dragged the allegation into public view. The case took its most explosive turn when court filings opposing Keefe D's bid for bail surfaced his claim that Sean Diddy Combs had placed a $1 million bounty on Tupac and Suge Knight, with legal documents reportedly referencing Combs roughly 77 times across his various names. Law enforcement was quick to point out at the time that Combs was never actually treated as a suspect, and Tupac's own family responded by hiring investigators to dig further into any possible connection. Now, that same allegation was being played back in open court, with a jury actually hearing it as sworn testimony rather than tabloid rumor. A former LAPD detective took the stand to walk jurors through the investigation that followed Davis's original claims, describing how a former Los Angeles Police Department detective delivered testimony in the trial over the 1996 murder of Tupac Shakur, tying Combs to the alleged payment scheme. The problem for prosecutors is that Davis has since walked the story back completely, and his current explanation is almost as dramatic as the original claim. Speaking to Fox 5 before the trial started, Davis said flatly that his lawyer gave him a script to read and told him that's the only way he's going home, so he read the script, essentially accusing his own former legal team of coaching him into fabricating the Diddy bounty story to secure a deal. That contradiction is exactly what Davis's current attorney has leaned into. Sanft has repeatedly challenged the prosecution to prove that any of Davis's past statements were even true in the first place, treating the entire body of interviews and book material as unreliable no matter which direction it points. But it's not just legal statements causing problems. There's also older audio, released back in 2024 by a documentary filmmaker, where Davis complained bitterly that he never actually got paid the money he claims he was owed. In that recording, Davis can be heard griping that he wished he'd just taken jewelry directly instead of accepting a promise of cash. At one point saying about Diddy that man's got about 50 phones, he can throw that stuff away. He gets phones easy. Dwayne Davis also told the police that he would have kept quiet about Diddy's alleged involvement in Tupac Shakur's murder if he had received his half of the payment. That detail alone is what makes rappers so locked in on this trial. It's not just a murder case anymore, it's a case where the state's own key witness against himself has admitted his silence was for sale and the price never got paid. That's the kind of detail that turns an already historic case into something the entire culture treats as appointment viewing. Combs, for his part, has denied any connection to Tupac's death for well over a decade. Back in 2011, he was already on record dismissing the entire theory, calling the story pure fiction and completely ridiculous. He's had no public comment during this trial for a very specific reason. He's currently serving time himself. Diddy remains imprisoned at New Jersey's FCI Fort Dix under a 50-month term for transporting people for prostitution, after jurors acquitted him of racketeering and sex trafficking charges from his own separate trial. So while his name gets read into a murder case in Las Vegas, the man himself is locked in a federal facility on the opposite coast, unable to respond in real time to any of it. That hasn't stopped rappers from having a field day with the timing. 50 Cent, who has built years of his online persona around mocking Diddy at every opportunity, jumped on the bounty testimony within hours of it becoming public, sharing a courtroom clip captioned with a jab about somebody getting careless with the money. It was 50 doing what 50 does, turning a genuinely dark piece of testimony about an alleged murder-for-hire plot into a meme, because in his world, any Diddy headline is content. But the reaction wasn't universally jokes. For a lot of older heads who lived through the East Coast, West Coast era firsthand, hearing this tape played in a real courtroom, with a real jury 30 years later, hit differently. It wasn't rumor anymore. It was sworn testimony being weighed by 12 people who will decide whether Keefe D goes away for the rest of his life. And that tension between people treating this as entertainment and people treating it as the closing chapter of one of hip-hop's deepest wounds runs straight into the next part of this story. Because it's exactly the tension that's been driving Suge Knight, Snoop Dogg, and an entire generation of street-affiliated figures crazy for the last 2 years. Long before this trial started, the accusation at the center of it had already caused a very public falling out between two of death row's most famous names, Suge Knight and Snoop Dogg. It started with an interview Suge gave from prison, where he accused Snoop of quietly trying to help get Keefe D out on bail. During the conversation, Suge claimed Snoop was allegedly trying to put up money to get Keefe D free. Knight didn't stop there. In a follow-up clip, he went further, claiming Snoop was secretly trying to bail out Keefe D to hide his involvement in Pac's death, alleging that Snoop was getting Keefe D out of jail to prevent him from talking further. Snoop didn't let that sit for long. He responded directly in the comments of the post that made the accusation, dismissing the whole thing as Suge being obsessed with him. THA Dogfather quickly responded to Knight's claim, accusing his former CEO of being obsessed with him, and attributing his seeming smear campaign to jealousy over Snoop now being the owner of Death Row. That last part matters. Snoop actually bought Death Row Records back in 2022, meaning the label Suge built and lost is now legally Snoop's, and every accusation Suge throws his way carries an undertone of resentment over exactly that. Suge's claims went even further than just bail money. In that same round of interviews, he suggested a whole network of industry figures were nervous about what Keefe D might say, naming several names and claiming that Keefe D was telling it all. And the more he talks, the more they get hurt by the situation. Once the actual trial started, Suge kept talking, this time straight from a phone in prison during a live TMZ segment. He didn't just attack the defense. He went after the state's own witnesses. Suge is calling BS on the trial, saying one of the witnesses taking the stand isn't telling the real story. And he joined TMZ live from prison and unloaded on James McDonald. Suge flatly denied that McDonald, aka Mob James, ever actually worked security for him or for Death Row, telling the show he flat out denies McDonald's claim that he worked for Death Row Records, and claims McDonald is an FBI informant, arguing there'd be plenty of proof if McDonald really worked for him. Suge even got specific about it, insisting if he did work for me, he would have had a Death Row chain, he would have had a ring, you would have seen him in pictures around us hanging out. That's a wild thing to hear. A man in prison who was in the car when Tupac was shot, actively disputing the resume of a prosecution witness in a live TV interview while the trial is still happening. Meanwhile, the broader culture around this trial has revealed something that a lot of commentators say is bigger than just this one case. A pattern of street-affiliated figures talking their way into legal trouble on camera. Long before any courtroom ever gets involved, there's an entire ecosystem of interview podcasts, led by outlets like Vlad TV, where men with real street history sit down and describe their pasts in granular detail, sometimes for clout, sometimes for money. And Keefe D's own case is now treated as the cautionary tale for the entire genre. That reaction has been loud from people still active in that same interview circuit. One rapper reportedly declined to elaborate on a story involving people who'd since died, giving nothing but a knowing look rather than naming names on record, aware of exactly how that kind of statement can be repackaged and used later. Atlanta podcaster Big Bank Black addressed the pattern directly, joking with frustration that these podcast guys will get somebody 100 years. These same guys want somebody to go out like Keefe D. That's a direct reference to Keefe D's situation being used as a warning across the entire industry, a reminder of what happens when bragging gets turned into evidence decades later. Former BMF kingpin Big Meech has taken the message even further, publicly stating he has no plans to ever sit down for that kind of interview. A decision that lines up perfectly with what's happening in that Las Vegas courtroom right now. When your own bragging can be legally frozen in time and read back to a jury 20 years later, plenty of people who lived that same life are deciding silence is worth more than a viral interview. And that brings the entire cast of this story back together in one place. A defendant undone by his own past interviews, a trial being narrated in real time by TMZ and social media clips, a mogul in a separate prison, getting dragged back into a decades-old bounty allegation, a death row founder disputing witnesses from behind bars, and an entire generation of street-affiliated public figures watching all of it as a warning about what happens when you talk too much for too long. Which brings us to where things actually stand right now, heading into the back half of a trial that's already reshaped how an entire industry thinks about interviews, memoirs, and old confessions. As of this week, the trial is still very much in progress, and there's a long way left to go. The trial is expected to last upwards of 4 weeks, with close to 200 witnesses that could end up on the stand. That means everything covered here. Mob James being called a rat, the Diddy bounty tape, Suge Knight's live TV rebuttals is really just the opening stretch of a case that's going to keep generating headlines for weeks. Keefe D faces life in prison if convicted, and nothing about the trial so far suggests the state is running out of ammunition. Beyond Mob James and Reggie Wright, prosecutors have lined up a former FBI agent, additional LAPD detectives, and a long list of names connected to both death row and the rival bad boy camp of the mid-90s. Suge Knight himself remains on the potential witness list, watching the case unfold from prison in San Diego, rather than from a courtroom seat, which hasn't stopped him from commenting almost daily anyway. The defense strategy has stayed consistent throughout. Treat everything Davis has ever said publicly as performance rather than confession. Sanft has continued pressing prosecutors on every piece of taped testimony, arguing that a man selling books and podcast appearances has every incentive to exaggerate his own importance. In a story that made him semi-famous within hip-hop circles for 2 decades, whether a jury buys that argument after hearing his own voice describe details only an insider would know is going to be the entire ballgame. What's remarkable, watching this unfold in real time, is how much the reaction from rappers has mirrored the reaction from the actual courtroom. Nobody in either space is fully unified. Some treat it as long overdue justice for Tupac. Some treat it as entertainment, ready-made for a meme within minutes of new testimony breaking. Some, like Suge Knight, treat it as an opportunity to settle old scores that have nothing directly to do with the murder charge itself. And some, like Big Meech and Big Bank Black, are using it purely as a lesson about what happens when you let cameras capture too much of your past. Even Tupac's own case for silence has become part of the courtroom record now. The detail that a former Las Vegas cop claims Tupac knew who shot him but wouldn't rat the killer out to cops sits at the emotional center of this entire trial. Tupac himself dying, refused to snitch, nearly 30 years later. The man accused of orchestrating that death is being convicted, if he's convicted at all, largely because he couldn't stop talking about it for 2 decades afterward. That contrast is what's made this trial impossible for the culture to look away from. It's not really about whether the streets stay loyal anymore. Mob James proved that loyalty, or at least the refusal to actively help send someone to prison, still exists even between men who don't like each other. The real story running through this entire trial is about what happens once a life gets turned into content. Every interview, every book chapter, every Vlad TV appearance that made Keefe D a minor celebrity in true crime circles. For years is now the exact material being used to potentially put him away for the rest of his life. The jury still has to weigh all of it: the tape, the memoir, the detective's testimony, Mob James's reluctant appearance, the disputed Diddy bounty claim, the walked-back confession about a script his old lawyer supposedly handed him. Whatever verdict comes down at the end of this month, it's going to close a chapter that hip-hop has carried unresolved for 30 years. And regardless of that outcome, the reaction from the culture watching it play out, Suge from prison, 50 Cent from his phone, Snoop from a distance, Big Meech from the sidelines, has already told its own story about what this case means to the people who lived through the era it came from. For now, the courtroom stays open. The witness list stays long. And the man who spent 20 years talking about killing Tupac Shakur is finding out in real time just how much of that talk is about to cost him.